The following is a real recording of a real coaching session. If you're interested in getting some coaching yourself, you can find the link in the description. Thanks and enjoy the video. All right. So what I wanted to start with today was actually going through some kind of taking a step back from just looking at breaking down hands in the way that we did before, but kind of using a bit more of an approach of making sure that I can explain certain theory concepts and just sort of giving you a good foundation of how to actually make your decisions in certain spots. So I have a visual, I guess you could call it a visual aid that I put together a while back that might be useful for this. And it really just relates to how we decide on flop bet sizes, basically. So how we arrive at, if we're trying to take a strategy of, we're going to go with a relatively uncomplicated sort of single size strategy, and we're not going to try to have different sizes with different hands and things like that. This graphic is going to be a good guide as to how we can sort of shortcut our way to picking the right size. This is what it is. I put it together using a tool called Lucid Spark, which is just like a kind of a visual tool that you can make graphics and stuff with. And what it basically is this sort of grid graphic here on the right. And ultimately, it's a tool that actually can be useful in pretty much any spot if you're just picking a single size strategy, because it kind of gives us a pretty good starting point for thinking about how, what the incentives of our range are based on how many different types of hands exist in that range, and, what frequency certain hands exist and things like that. So just to run you through how it's constructed, the x-axis, so the horizontal axis here, represents the frequency that we're going to be betting. And this is mostly going to be dictated by how many weak hands exist in our opponent's range. If there's a situation where our opponent has a lot of hands that are trivially obvious folds or weak enough that they just have to fold to even a small bet, then that's much more likely to encourage us to just be betting at a very high frequency. And of course, this is much more commonly going to be the case on the flop than on any other street. It's pretty rare that we get to, say, the turn or the river, and our opponent has so many weak hands that they're just going to be folding a trivial frequency, right? So this is mostly for the flop. The y-axis, so the vertical axis, is going to represent the sizing. And this is mostly dictated by the opposite factor, which is how many strong hands exist in our opponent's range. And mostly this is going to be, relatively applicable to pretty much any spot. There are some slight nuances, but generally speaking, if we focus our energy on our opponent's range and what types of hands exist within it, we're going to do pretty well. Now, I did originally have, it says each of the 25 squares, I did originally have this left-hand column with its own numbers, but basically we don't need that anymore because the left-hand column pretty much denotes that we're not betting anything. So we just don't have to have numbers there. But basically each of these squares represents an approximate strategy. So if we chose to bet somewhat often with a medium size, then this is going to represent a strategy where we bet maybe half pot or 2/3 pot with roughly half of our range. And that would mean we were somewhere in the square number 10 or 11, right? Something like that. We would be betting somewhat often with a medium-ish kind of size. And our goal here really is not necessarily to just nail the exact right size every time or anything like that. It's just to ensure that we're in the right approximate territory, because that's going to get us to a point of having a really well-constructed range in any situation. If we're one square either side, sort of one square up or down, or, one square left or right, then we're generally doing pretty well. And even if we go one square diagonally, we're usually not going to be doing that badly. But our goal is really to make sure that we don't get to the point where we're, 2 squares off or 3 squares off or whatever, right? Because that's going to end up with us choosing a strategy that's really not going to work particularly well for the spot that we're in. Everything making sense so far?
Yeah. In regards to very small to overbet,
Yeah.
Would very small represent 2 big blinds, overbet 2x the pot, or
Very small would generally represent about quarter pot or less.
Okay.
And I don't want to phrase it in terms of number of big blinds because this still applies in like, three bet pots or something, right? I would say that you could even say that it applies to 20% pot or less, something like that,
Fine.
because small would be quarter pot, one third pot, something like that. Medium is generally about between 45-ish to 67 or 45-ish to 70. Large is going to be 75 to 100, and overbet is obviously greater than 100, right? So
Yeah.
that's a reasonable way of looking at things. You could actually, if you wanted to just assume that overbet is greater than 100%, then you basically would divide everything else here into just four quadrants. So large would be 75 to 100, medium would be 50 to 75, small would be 25 to 50, and very small would be less than 25, right? So that might be a pretty reasonable way to do it.
Makes sense.
Our goal is to be in the right area, right? And our biggest sizing option in any given situation, it's usually going to be approximately 2E. So 2E means a two street geometric sizing. It means that we're betting a size that's going to allow us to shove all in for the same size on the next street. We don't generally want to go any bigger than this very often without being all in, because it's going to create a sizing on the next street that is too small, right? We don't really want to put a ton of money in on the flop and then have a very small SPR left on the turn, or vice versa. So the biggest sizing we're usually going to use is going to be in the region of 2E, and we will occasionally go a little bit bigger, but not that often. Broadly speaking, we're going to cap out at if 2E is 150% in a certain spot, we're never going to bet any bigger than 150%. We can just cap it out at that point. The left column here is all in red, because if we decide on a strategy of checking our entire range, then we're obviously not using any bet size at all. Now, this is going to be very rare, actually, it's not going to be that rare, because if we looked at this from the perspective of, let's say we're in the big blind facing a raise and we call, well, there's going to be most flops, we're going to check our entire range, right? So in general, that actually will happen quite a bit. But as the pre-flop raiser, this isn't really going to happen that often. The key, though, is that anytime we get somewhat close to a range check or a range bet, we may as well bet the entire range or check the entire range, because that additional complexity that's created by having, maybe 10% of our range that bets or something is not really usually worth it when it comes to the EV. Now, I did originally have this right-hand column colored in green as well, because if we're range betting, we're just betting every single hand in our range. But I did think it was important to start distinguishing between situations where we're range betting for a small size, and then situations where we're range betting for bigger sizes. We're not really very often going to range bet for an overbet or even a large bet, but there will be some situations where a larger range bet, a medium sized kind of range bet, is actually going to be pretty good. So I didn't want to just lump all these together in the same category. But obviously, if we are range checking, we're not using any bet size. So they are all the same category. Now, the starting point for us really can be one of two things. It can be, in any given situation, we can start by establishing which horizontal plane or which vertical plane we're going to be on. We don't necessarily need to pick them both at the same time. We can pick one first and say, okay, well, how many strong hands does my opponent have? How many weak hands? And I can go from there. And whichever one is most obvious, we can then start to, narrow it down. So if we, for example, recognize that our opponent's range contains very few strong hands, then we know we're probably going to want to go with a strategy that's going to be on that top row, right? Because any strategy where they have very few strong hands is going to be somewhere in that 1, 2, 3, or 4. And then we can say, okay, well, if we think they have very few strong hands, how many weak hands do they have? If they have very few strong hands, but not that many weak hands, it means we're going to bet big when we do bet, but we're not going to bet very often, right? We're going to bet pretty rarely. If they have very few strong hands, but also a lot of very weak hands, well, that means we might get to range bet for an overbet size. Now, that's really rare. So it's probably more likely to be something like a 3 as opposed to a 4 here. But that might mean that, we do get to bet very often, and we get to use a really big size. and I'll show you a few examples of some different spots that fit these different categories here where possible. In general, the idea that we're looking at here is that we want to really focus on the just identifying one plane, whether it's the sizing first and then the frequency, or whether it's the frequency first and then the sizing. We can narrow down where our strategy is going to end up being at. And as long as we're, somewhere in that approximate correct ballpark, we're going to do pretty well in any given spot. Does that all make sense?
Yeah.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just open up a, fairly general kind of a situation. So we're going to go 60 big blinds, fairly sort of standard stack size for early game situations. And we're going to go under the gun big blind just to showcase how this works in a few different situations. The first board texture that I want to look at is, by the way, we're going to use the matrix to decide on this before we actually look at the sim result. We're going to look at a board of ace 4 here, right? So we want to think about this texture in terms of all these variables that we just talked about. So if the board is ace 4 rainbow, let's kind of zoom in on this now. How many, if we're facing the big blind here against our under the gun open, how many strong hands does villain have on this board? Just approximately.
We raised, they flattened.
Yeah, we opened under the gun, they flattened the big blind, the flop is ace 4.
I would say not many.
Okay. What, talk me through that in some more detail. What's the reasoning there?
Here you go. So they could flat any weak ace.
Yeah, they could, right? And
Yeah.
those hands are, how strong are those hands on this board of ace 4?
Extremely, yeah.
Yeah, they're very strong, right? So in fact, immediately, just from the fact that it's ace 4, we can note that our opponent does at least have a pretty good number of strong hands, right? Because any ace is a pretty strong hand here, right? Any ace is happy to play at least a reasonably big pot here. So what we could do is we can kind of rule out some sections of this, right? What I like to do is just cut off a portion of it and then go from there. So we know from the fact that it's ace X here, it's not going to be the top row. It's not going to be the second row, because it's definitely not the case that our opponent has few or very few strong hands. And it's probably also not the middle row, because they actually have quite a lot of strong hands here. They have a lot of that ace X that just makes trips immediately. So I would say we pretty much end up in a position of, we know just immediately that our bet size here is going to be somewhere in the territory of the bottom 2 rows, right? It's going to be 13 to 20, basically, in terms of how we would define it here. With that in mind, we now have to think about how many weak hands our opponent has. So on this ace 4 rainbow, how many weak hands do we think they have?
They have a lot of both, right? Because their range is pretty wide there.
Exactly. They have quite a lot of weak hands here as well, right? So that kind of leads us to, well, we don't think that they're either in this middle column or the left column, or basically any of the left 3 columns. We know that they're either in the far right column or the right column next to that. So in fact, we've actually narrowed down our strategy to somewhere in this bottom corner, right? We've got 15, 16, 19, or 20, right? We've got anything that in this area can be fine here, right? Now, a range bet for a very small size is going to work fine. Range bet for slightly bigger than that, probably also going to work fine. If we did find some hands that check, it's going to be okay as well. But I think the main thing is to kind of recognize that we're somewhere in this bottom corner on this board. No strategy that kind of goes beyond this. No strategy that goes into like betting half pot, betting 2/3 pot, anything like that is really going to start to become very viable. And at the same time, any strategy that features, a high frequency of checking, probably also not going to be great here. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is kind of where we're going to go. And if we look at what the solver wants to do, I would assume it's going to probably fit pretty well with that. Not 100% sure, but we shall see. So that's big blind checking everything. And then, oh yeah, nice and easy, right? Under the gun wants to range bet quarter pot here, right? So just bet our entire range for a small size. So I picked this board because I was hoping it would say this. And it does. It says range bet small size, right? Very, very trivial, simple spot. So this is right in that number 16 or number 20 territory. And it's quite simple. It's quite straightforward. That makes sense?
Yes.
Okay. So this is one sort of extreme end of the strategy here. Now, let's go to the opposite end of the board textures. And let's say we get a board of 8, 7, 5 rainbow. What about this one? How many, first of all, actually, let's just kind of throw this to you here. What jumps out immediately? Like, what's the first thing that you would be aware of here on this board in terms of, what your opponent's range looks like?
I mean, kind of like on the same hand as the ace board, where they could have their range is so wide where they possibly flop the straight, two
Okay.
pairs, sets.
Okay.
Mm,
I think you're right in that they certainly have, well, they can certainly have pocket eights here. There's not really any reason why they would 3-bet pocket eights against under the gun here, but basically they can have all 3 sets. They can have a lot of 2 pairs. They can have straights. But in terms of the overall frequency, it's certainly going to be different than the ace 4 because the types of hands that interact with this board texture are going to be a bit different. And there's also certain hands that they can have that we can't ever have ourselves here, right? They can have 6-4 suited or 9-6 suited, and we can never have those. So there are quite a lot of strong hands here, but it's also notable that those strong hands that they do have are not, they're not invincible strong hands here because the board texture can change, right? There are cards that can alter the board on the turn to a certain degree. So if we go back over here, in terms of the number of strong hands in our opponent's range, well, I think that it's reasonable to assume that it's certainly not this top category, right? They're certainly not
yeah.
in the very few strong hands category, certainly not in the few strong hands category, because we know they can have all those 2 pairs and stuff. But we also probably wouldn't put them in these bottom 2 categories either, these many strong hands or very many strong hands, right? Because even though they do have a decent chunk of strong hands on this board, they probably don't have 9-6 offsuit. They might not have 6-4 offsuit. There's hands here that they don't have. And there's also a lot of the 2 pairs and stuff here. They don't have exactly, super high equity because they are quite vulnerable. So I would say that in terms of the number of strong hands, we're probably going to put it somewhere in the middle here, right?
Yeah.
We're probably going to it's not really going to be too far on either extreme here. Now, on the weak hands part of the equation, what would we say about that, right? This 8-7-5. How many weak hands does our opponent have here?
I'd say there's a few. I mean, if they're flatting with Jack 10, Queen Jack, King
Well,
Jack,
Jack 10 has
King
2 overs and a
10.
gut shot, right? Jack 10 is a
Yeah.
pretty medium strength hand here. That's, I think an important thing about these low card board textures is that we have to recognize that even 2 overcards is not that weak of a hand here, right?
Okay.
If we think about Queen Jack on this board compared to Queen Jack on Ace 4, Queen Jack is almost dead against an ace on that board. But in this situation, Queen Jack has overcards against a lot of top pairs and things like that, right? So when it comes down to the weak hands category, we want to look at that really as how many hands does our opponent have that pretty much have to fold to any bet size, right?
Yeah.
And in this case, the thing about this type of board texture is that there aren't that many hands that would just automatically fold to any bet size, right? There are some, but there aren't that many. So in the end, this kind of ends up being a spot where they have some weak hands, but they don't have a ton and they don't have like none, right? So in fact, this board texture, I would imagine, is going to end up pretty much smack in the middle, right? It's going to end up like a 10, maybe an 11, something in that area where we're definitely going to be able to bet at a reasonable rate, but we're not going to do it with a huge size. We're also not going to really benefit that much from using a small size. So let's see what size the solver likes here. Hoping that it's going to go with what I want it to go with here, but we shall see. The big blind checks. Yeah, okay, nice and easy, right? We are betting about half the time. So in terms of frequency, we're right in that middle territory somewhat often. And then we're betting 75% pot, right? We're betting a medium to large size. So this is like a number 6, basically, or maybe a number 10, depending on where you want to put that threshold. But it's right in that middle zone, right? And obviously the way that we construct this range is going to be kind of the next step on this chart, because we have to make sure that our range is constructed in a way that has the right types of hands in it, right types of bluffs, and so on. But as a starting point of what our bet size would look like, this is leading us very much in the right direction, right? We're seeing already this graphic is giving us a very viable strategy that is pretty close to what the solver wants here, without a ton of effort beyond how many weak hands, how many strong hands. The answer to both was some, but not that many. And therefore we end up in this territory of betting fairly often with a medium size, and we kind of take it from there. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So let's do a few more. Let's go through some more boards, and we'll kind of just practice implementing this basically. Let's generate random flop. Okay, so the random flop that got generated is Jack of clubs, 10 of spades, 7 of spades. What do we think about this one?
Can we bring up the grid again?
Yeah, of course. So how many, first of all, is there anything that jumps out? Weak hands, strong hands? What seems to be the case here?
I'm leaning towards the 6, 7, 10, 11 range.
Okay, so we're thinking kind of similar to the 875. Yeah.
Yeah.
Talk me through the reasoning behind that.
Just thinking of what their range chart would look like.
Okay. So I think you're pretty accurate there. I think you're doing a pretty good job there of sort of nailing down what might be a good approach for us. Let's talk through basically the extremes here, right? What are the strongest hands in their range? How many really strong hands do they have here?
I would expect them to 3-bet pocket jacks, pocket
Okay.
tens, possibly a flat, 8-9 suited, massively strong hand.
Yep. Yeah. 8-9 is definitely in there. Probably 8-9 offsuit is also in there as well. We have to consider that. Then they also have a lot of the 2 pairs as well. They probably do have jacks in this formation against under the gun here, or at least they should. So they have basically a lot of the sets, 2 pairs and straights. So they do have a decent chunk of strong hands, right? And that's not a massive frequency by any means, but it is certainly enough that I think we can rule out any of these top 2 rows, basically, I would think. So we're looking at something in the bottom 3 rows here. But now when it comes to weak hands, well, what would we say there? What types of weak hands do they potentially have here?
Suited aces outside of the spades, suited kings outside of the spades.
Yeah. So this is good, because these are the kind of things that make this board slightly different from the previous one, in that this board now is one where something like an ace or a king with a low kicker is now a pretty weak hand, right? So on 875, the high card, low card, ace high, low kicker type stuff, well, those hands would have made a pair a bit more easily, a gut shot, something like that on that board. But on this board, ace 6, ace 5, ace 4, ace 3, ace deuce, king 6 and below, queen 6 and below, all of those hands are pretty weak now, right? They just have one overcard, and if they don't have the spades, they're in pretty weak shape. So in the end, I think this is actually a spot where villain has maybe a slightly higher frequency of weak hands here. Maybe something like an 11 might be good here, where we're betting a bit more often, and we're betting for kind of a small to medium size, 11 or a 15 possibly here. Probably not going to like a 7 necessarily. I would say though that what's quite important here is that in the solver with the Octopi Poker Sims, the only options that the solver has for simplicity in these specific spots are bet 25%, bet 75%, and then bet 125%. So we just want to keep in mind that the solver doesn't technically have the bet 50% option in this specific spot, but obviously in other cases it would. And in real gameplay, of course, we have that option as well. So let's look at what the answer is here, or what the outcome is, I suppose. I would think that we're probably pretty accurate with what we said just there. So big blind checks. And we have, yeah, okay. So this is actually kind of a split sizing, which is it's kind of indicating, because the solver is sort of stuck between B25 and B75. It's indicating that B50 would probably be pretty good, right? So that kind of puts us in this medium bet territory. And it's actually pretty close to a range bet here. It's betting 93% of the time. So in fact, it wasn't just an 11, it was actually closer to about a 12 here. That's, it's a good board for us, because villain does have, more weak hands than we might have thought here. If I look at the big blinds range overall, they have a straight draw 36% of the time. So they have a lot of 9x and 8x hands, but they also have nothing. So queen high or worse, basically 12% of the time, which is a pretty decent chunk of hands that are just completely whiffing this board, completely weak. And then ace high and king high, they have those two categories 26% of the time combined, right? So that is quite a lot of hands that are not particularly strong. So that's kind of what's leading us into being a bit more aggressive here. We're going with an 11 or a 12 as opposed to something like a 10. But I think what a lot of people's instinct is on certain boards like this is, they just want to go with they end up going with a large bet with a low frequency. So they go with a 5 or a 6, right? And in fact, going with a 5 or a 6 here would be quite a long way away from a 12, which is what the solver actually wants to go with. So we would probably end up making at least a few mistakes there if we did go with a 5 or a 6. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So let's now pick another one. Generate random flop. Ace Jack 7. Is that a good one to look at? Yeah, we could probably look at this one. Okay. Ace Jack 7, 2 diamonds. Any thoughts about this one? First of all, how many strong hands does our opponent have here? Or how many hands that are capable of playing a big pot?
There were a few. I'd say due to our opening position, we probably have more.
We do, but at this point, we actually don't really need to think that much about our own range.
Okay.
So we're just mostly focused on their range. If we look for the top down, well, they can't have pocket aces, which is nice. They probably can have jacks, but we don't know exactly how often. Sevens, they can definitely have.
Yeah.
Ace Jack, Ace 7, Jack 7 suited, they can have. But again, those hands are not super nutted here. Those are a little bit more vulnerable. So in the end, I think we can say that they have some strong hands here. They have a few strong hands, but they don't have a ton. They don't have all three sets, which is quite meaningful. Any board where only 2 of the sets are in our opponent's range immediately is a little bit less good for them. So in the end, I think that probably puts them at something like maybe a few strong hands or some strong hands. I don't think it puts them at many or very many. I think it's super unlikely that we're going to see something like that here. We're looking at few or some. I don't know if we're looking at very few though. Now, what about the weak hands? What kind of weak hands can we identify here?
Connectors down to 4, 5, 5, 6 would be in there suited.
Yeah. I mean, I think we can identify that they have quite a few hands that are just undercards to the 7 that completely miss, right?
Mhm.
And then they also have stuff like King 6 and below. If they don't have diamonds, Queen 6 and below, some stuff like 10-6 suited. There's actually quite a lot of hands that are pretty weak here. So I would think that this one actually belongs somewhere in that quadrant between 7, 8, 11, and 12, right? I would say something like this, that this is a very good board for us. And then they do have some strong hands, but they don't have a ton. So let's take a look at, where we end up with this one. And then we'll pick a couple of different types of boards, because there's a couple types of boards that I think are important to discuss here. So villain checks. Oh yeah. Okay. So we are range betting. And again, it's kind of favoring the larger size, but there's also a little bit of the smaller size. So again, what I would do here is just average out these sizes to some degree. So it's preferring 75. It's going closer to 75, but there's also a little bit of 25. So I would say maybe 65, 70% is a good size here if you wanted to just bet your entire range for that size. But as you can see, it is a range bet. So it's this far right column here. And it's pretty much, I would say, like 12 or an 8, something like that, right? And I think a lot of people are going to maybe kind of misunderstand this board texture and basically not do enough betting in situations like this, right? They're going to miss some of these bet situations. So that's a useful one. Now, I want to look at a different type of board texture. I want to look at, let's go with Queen 6-3 all diamonds. So now we've got a different kind of a thing to worry about, right? We've got a board texture that is monotone. So let's come back to the matrix here. How many strong hands does our opponent have here?
I mean, your strongest hands, your flushes.
Yep. How
So
many flushes do they have?
should be number of combinations there.
Well,
Ace.
you don't have to worry about the number of combinations, but
okay, yeah.
I would just look at it as they're defending the big blind preflop. They have a range that contains a lot of suited hands. And even those suited hands are not the entirety of their range, they're going to be a pretty big chunk of their range. And then a quarter of those suited hands, approximately, are going to flop a flush. So usually, quite often on a monotone board, you're going to end up in a situation where any player can have a flush maybe about 8 to 10% of the time, right? Just based on the fact that ranges are going to be composed of a lot of suited hands. And that means that they do have quite a lot of strong hands, right? It's many or very many here. It's not going to be some few or very few. It's going to be many or very many, because a flush on a monotone board is a very strong hand. And anytime there's a monotone board, both players can flop a flush at a surprisingly high frequency, which is kind of why you see a lot of monotone boards playing in a way where you're not really supposed to do as much betting. You're not supposed to do as much check raising, and there's a little bit of hesitation from both players in a lot of spots. So I think we can probably put it in these bottom 2 rows here. I don't think we really need to go above that. And then we want to think about weak hands. How many weak hands do they have here in the big blind on this board?
A good amount.
Okay. What types of hands are we thinking of when we think of weak hands here that have to just fold to any bet?
Any suited ace. Oh, yeah. Any suited ace outside of the diamonds.
Yep.
Any suited king outside of diamonds. 7 connectors down to about 7, 8.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they have a lot of hands here that are just random suited hands that don't have any equity to continue, right? So they do have quite a lot of weak hands. So I would think that this is probably going to end up in the territory of maybe something like a 15 or a 19, probably something like that, where we can actually bet fairly often because our opponent does have quite a lot of weak hands, but we definitely should not bet bigger or even a medium size here. So let's take a look at where the sim ends up in this case. I would expect, relatively high frequency with a small size. Let's see.
30%.
Yeah. Okay. There we go. Basically range bet small, actually. So this is more actually like a 16 or a 20, pretty much, because villain does have, quite a lot of weak hands. But if we look at the response here and we look at, the frequencies that they have certain things, they have nothing 18% of the time, ace high, king high, 17, 11% of the time, but they have a flush 7% of the time. They have a set 1%, 2 pair, 2%, top pair 11%. So they have top pair plus like a total of 15% of the time or more here, which is, a pretty reasonable amount of top pair plus. And of course, they have a flush draw almost a quarter of the time. So they have a diamond in their hand a quarter of the time, roughly. And that's kind of what means that they're unlikely to have as many really weak hands, simply because as soon as they have any diamond in their hand, they're probably not going to fold to a bet, right? So in fact, if I highlight what they do with any one diamond, like if they have one diamond in their hand, they literally never fold here. Like a single diamond does not fold, even if it's 6-4 with the 4 of diamonds, 7-5 with the 7 of diamonds, because that has a gut shot as well. Like any diamond doesn't fold. So we're really just betting to take advantage of all the suited hands that they have that don't have a diamond, that are just trivial folds. And there's enough of them that we actually do get to range bet this spot. But as you can imagine, because they do have quite a decent chunk of flushes and other strong hands, we also don't get to really ever use a larger size here. That makes sense?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So this is a pretty good rule of thumb for monotone boards as well. We just don't use larger sizes. Now, let's pick a board that I think is going to be interesting. Okay, so I'm going to pick a board of 8, 8, 7 here. So this should be an interesting one. What do we think about villain's range here on this board? Paired board, rainbow paired board. Where do we think that might land here?
7 to 12? Yeah. Can't push that back to 6 to.
Okay. Talk me through why. Well, first of all, let's go through the strong hands in their range, right? What was your conclusion or what was your assumption there?
8. Show me the.
8, 8, 7.
Yeah, 8, 8, 7. They have an 8 a fair amount of the time.
Yep, they do. That's quite relevant here, right? It's a bit like the ace 4. If they have an 8 and they flop trips, that's a very, very strong hand. So they actually in this spot are probably not ever really going to be anything more than these bottom 2 rows, right? It's either very many or it's many. It's not going to be some, few, or very few, because any 8 is very strong here. And they can clearly have an 8 because they're defending the big blind with a lot of hands that have an 8 in them. So immediately paired board like this is going to be in the bottom 2 rows. And I think a pretty good rule of thumb is that almost any paired board is going to be in this bottom 2 category here when we're dealing with the big blind, because they have such a wide range that almost any paired board they can flop trips on at a reasonable frequency. The only exception is occasionally going to be stuff like boards where the deuce is the paired card and we're opening under the gun, so maybe they are going to fold like 9 deuce suited and stuff like that. But 8, 8, 7, they certainly can have an 8 quite easily. Every suited 8 they're going to be calling and things like that. So ultimately, they have quite a lot of strong hands here. So we're in these bottom 2 rows here. What about the weak hands? How many weak hands do they have?
Many weak hands.
Yeah, I would say probably not the very extreme category here, because unlike the ace 4, something like ace high here is a pretty strong hand, whereas king high on that other board would not have been as strong. So yeah, I would say they're probably in many weak hands, maybe not very many. Let's take a look at what the solver wants to do here. I would think it might be, I would certainly expect it to go with the small size. Frequency is what I'm not sure about. So the big blind actually does a little bit of leading out here, which is kind of interesting. When they check, we are, okay, so we're exactly 50-50 with bet and check and a small size, right? So we're actually pretty much, it's like a 14 here, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they have, or maybe even an 18. You could categorize it as a 14 or an 18, because they do have, they still have many or very many strong hands, but the number of weak hands they have is reduced by the fact that this is a board texture where, ace high hands, king high hands are pretty decent in terms of equity, right? And of course, the fact that they have some hands that lead out on the flop is going to affect this a little bit. But for now, we don't have to worry about that too much. The main idea here is just to just recognize that this is not quite the same as the ace 4, because our opponent doesn't have quite as many, very weak hands, right? And so it doesn't quite make as much sense for us to range bet it. And it looks like it pulls our frequency down into around this sort of middle column of somewhat often, basically. The last one that I want to do is, actually, no, I don't want to do anymore. Let's go on to using this for the turn, because what I want to show you is how we can actually get, this is a good one, king 10-7. I'm going to review simulation. King 10-7 is going to be the flop here, and I want to show you that the same principle can still be used on the turn. So let's say we get this king 10-7. The solver likes the B75 size here at a high rate, so we're going to use that. And then big blind's going to call. And then we're going to look at the turn card here. So turn card here is going to be a deuce of spades. Now, after it goes check, bet, call, and the turn is the deuce of spades, we're going to expect our opponent to check to us. So let's assume that they do. On this particular turn card, king 10-7 deuce, where would we assume villain to be in terms of strong hands, weak hands, and so on? What do you expect here after it goes check, bet, call?
I would probably start at some strong hands,
Okay,
move my way down.
sure. So some to many to very many.
Yeah, and those two, yeah, some to many as far as the strong
Okay.
hands.
So how are we on this turn card? How are you defining a strong hand? Like what do you count as a strong hand on King 10-7 deuce?
Set to sevens, set to tens, flop two pair,
Okay, sure. So bear in mind
king
though that
10.
the big blind did not raise the flop. So immediately, I think we would expect that set of sevens, set of tens, king 10, king 7, 10, 7. A lot of that stuff is going to raise the flop at some rate, right? They're not just going to auto call on the flop here. They're going to do some raising. They're going to do some calling. In a lot of cases, a lot of players will just automatically raise all their good hands on the flop here. So I do think it's true that villain has a few strong hands, but I don't think there's very many here because the crucial thing is that the deuce of spades, just doesn't really improve almost any hands, right? If you compare this to like a 9, for example, right? A 9 would complete 2 different straights, 3 different straights, actually. So a 9 would clearly be a card where the number of strong hands in villain's range would change, and it would probably go up quite a bit because of all the straights that are possible. But on a brick, nothing improves. So they really still just have a lot of one pair here. They have a lot of hands that are kind of medium strength, and they don't really have a lot that is in the stronger category. They don't really have very much that's capable of playing for stacks now because most of their strong stuff would raise flop. So in the end, I think we can probably put them in these top 2 rows, not the lower ones, because they don't really have very many strong hands. Even if they did, let's say, just never raise anything strong on the flop, like let's say they just never raise any 2 pair or sets on the flop, there's just not that many of those hands. And in comparison to the frequency that they just have like a king or a 10, right? They still just predominantly have a lot of one pair hands, right? So that's an important kind of aspect of this, and the deuce doesn't improve those hands. So I put them in the top two rungs of this for sure. And then in terms of the weak hands, how many very weak or weak hands do they have here that are just going to fold to any bet, bearing in mind that the flop bet size was relatively big here?
Wouldn't expect too many weekends to be in there.
Yeah, they don't really have a lot, right? They might have some straight draws that, didn't pick up a spade draw, and therefore they're just gonna fold now. 9-8 of clubs or something like that. They are gonna have some of those hands, but they're not really gonna have just a bunch of hands that are a trivial fold against any bet size. Even those draws, like if we were to just bet super small here, they probably wouldn't fold them, right? So in the end, they don't really have a ton of weak hands here. So I actually think that where we're probably landing is that we're getting to maybe something like a 1 or a 2 here, right? A 1, 2, 5, or 6. I don't think we're going to the point where we can bet like a high frequency, but I do think we're going into large bet territory. And it's because of the fact that they just don't have a ton of those, very strong hands. So let's take a look. If you can imagine villain checking their entire range here, pretty straightforward. Now, yeah, it's basically overbet or B75, right? So if we wanted to split the difference and go with B100, bet pot here, going to be very reasonable. And a lot of this comes down to, if we look at the big blinds range, in terms of the strength of their range here, they have a set 1% of the time. And this is even with calling 10s on the flop at a high frequency. So they're only really raising 7s on the flop. They have a set 1% of the time. So it's just super low frequency. 2 pair 4% of the time, which is king 7 mostly. Even if you bump these up to like 3% and 8%, that's just not that much of their range, right? It's just not possible for them to have that many strong hands here. So they have a lot of that. And then 26% top pair and 28% second pair, right? So when they call a big flop bet here, they just mostly have top pair or middle pair. They mostly have like exactly what you expect them to have, right? Top pair or middle pair. And they also have a lot of draws. They have 27% straight draws, 9% flush draws at this point, because a lot of those hands just improved to a spade draw, 2% combo draws, and so on. So they have quite a few draws. They have quite a few single pair hands, but they don't really have a lot of super weak stuff, right? There's not really anything weak that's there because of the size of the flop bet and the range that continues. And by contrast, there's also not really a lot of strong stuff. And when that's the case, we now build a big bet strategy. We build a polarized approach. And as you can see, the solver is going to that approach here quite a bit. Now, if I was to go to the runouts tab and show the turn and river runouts, or specifically the turn runouts for this specific spot, there's a couple things you can notice here, right? In terms of the ranking of the card, first of all, if the turn is an ace, that completes a straight. And that shifts us strategy-wise into a lot more medium and small betting and a lot less big betting. And the reason for that is because when the turn's an ace here, now the big blind does have quite a lot of hands that are pretty weak on this turn, right? If they just have a 7, if they have like a weak 10 and the turn's an ace, well, that's a pretty weak hand now, and they're going to fold to almost any bet size. So that ups the number of weak hands that are in their range. And it does slightly increase the number of strong hands in that Queen Jack just got there as well. So it is a spot that they do have enough weak hands that we get to bet quite a lot on an ace, but we're not betting particularly big. If we looked at a king, well, a king doesn't change the board that much. They make trips sometimes, but we make trips sometimes as well. So there are, generally speaking, going to still be quite a few weak hands in their range on a king, but we're not using that overbet size with any real frequency here, because there's also quite a lot of strong hands in their range as well. And the queen, the jack, both of those cards can complete some straights. They can complete some two pairs. So those are hands that are going to give them certainly still a few more weak hands. They're going to turn a 7 or a 10 into a pretty weak hand when the queen or the jack comes out. But there's going to be some strong hands there too. A 10, it's a card where, they do improve the trips quite a bit. So they don't have as many weak hands. We're not betting as often, but when we do bet, you're betting kind of a medium to largish sort of size. 9 is fairly similar to a queen or a jack. An 8 is fairly similar to a 9. A 7, we are a little bit cautious about, because of course the big blind can have a 7, and they don't have as many weak hands now because, a lot of their hands that did have a fairly weak 7 just improved to trips, but they also don't have a ton of strong hands either. And then once we get into the low cards, you get the 6, which completes the straight, which is kind of interesting. But then a 5, 4, 3, or deuce, any of these cards, these are cards where the opponent now has very, very few strong hands, because almost nothing in their flop range improved on these turn cards. And they don't actually have a ton of weak hands either, because they just mostly have one pair. And all of these turn cards, you can see that we're quite clearly more likely to use the overbet size on. And if I was to go suit and rank here, there's not like a ton of variation based on the suit, because the flop is rainbow, right? The suit of the turn doesn't matter as much when the flop is rainbow. So we don't have to care that much about that. Instead, the rank and then the suit are pretty good ways to take a look at these turns. But you can quite clearly see there's a trend here where when the turn's a brick, we use these big bet sizes. When the turn is not a brick and it improves some hands in our opponent's range, we use sizes that are a bit more reflective of maybe trying to just put some pressure on a 10. And then an ace specifically just is so good for our range and so bad for so much of their range that we get to bet quite a lot more often. And we actually do it with some medium to smallish sort of sizes here. Anyway, yeah. So that's kind of the sort of breakdown, I suppose, of how we're going to use this and apply this. And what we can do next time is start to go through some hands, go through some situations, maybe with the trainer, and just talk through some of these ideas and think about how we're going to be applying them, and then start to build out the process of how we actually select what hands are going to bet and what hands are going to check in any given situation. So for example, if we're picking like a strategy that's like a number, where would we be? So like right here, let's say we're picking a number 10 strategy. Well, how do we actually select the hands that are going to bet, right? That's the next step in this process. But the first step is for any given situation, whether it's a flop, turn, river, whatever it is, if we can have a reasonably good idea of how our range is going to be built and how our opponent's range looks, then we're usually going to be able to build a strategy that's going to be pretty coherent and pretty logical. And it's then going to serve us well across multiple streets instead of ending up with, what we sometimes get, which is they'll bet, they'll kind of not have a clear idea of what their strategy is in any given spot, which ends up with them betting different sizes with different hands, right? They bet big with some hands, they bet small with other hands, and their strategy just is not fitting together nicely. So that's kind of what we want to avoid. And as we go forward and we look at some different types of spots, we'll be able to pick out the situations where we want to use a certain strategy or another strategy. And, the solver sims that we're going to be looking at in Octopi, they're simplified enough that there are, some pretty good guidelines in place, or some pretty good approaches that we can look at and approximate based on the sizes that are available. Quite often you're going to see that the solver has like a small size and then a larger size available. And depending on the distribution of those two sizes in a certain spot, we can start to see, okay, it's shifting more towards like a 6 or a 7, or it's a 15 or a 16, or whatever it's doing. So we can make estimations there. All right, that's a good spot to wrap it up